You have been following Michele Bachmann. Talk about the views that you feel are especially important to understand and her whole career development.
Well, I think to understand her, she is, even more than Sarah Palin, probably more than any political figure, maybe short of Mike Huckabee, a perfect product of the religious right. You know, she came out of the big fundamentalist, or the big evangelical upsurge of the 1970s. Like many evangelicals, including Pat Robertson, was initially enamored of Jimmy Carter, who was the first modern born-again candidate. Like the movement as a whole, she shifted abruptly to the right in the run-up to Reagan's election. And she often talks about, in her speeches, what she calls a Christian worldview, which is a really important concept, I think, for people to understand, not just Michele Bachmann, but much of the modern right. It essentially holds that Christianity, or at least their version of Christianity, is a total ideology. It has all the answers, not just to theological questions, but to historical questions, scientific questions, economic questions. And so, you know, what I've tried to get across in writing and speaking about Michele Bachmann is that she's not stupid, you know, and she's not Sarah Palin in that she's articulate. She's, I think, a little bit faster on her feet. She's just incredibly steeped in a body of knowledge that is not. She's incredibly steeped in a corpus of facts that aren't true facts. She's incredibly steeped in the alternate reality of the movement that I called Christian nationalism in my first book. And so a lot of things that she says, you know, when she, for example, one of her most celebrated gaffes was when she talked about the founders of this country working tirelessly against slavery, and how, you know, at the dawn of America, it didn't matter what color you were, it didn't matter your economic status. Of course, you know, this is absurd and everybody laughed at it, but if you look at some of, say, the books that she worked on when she was a student at Oral Roberts University, or you look at the whole kind of canon of Christian nationalist revisionist history, this stuff is all a truism. And so to a lot of her base, this isn't going to sound like gaffes. This is their reality.
What books did you work on?
Well, one of the, I don't know why this hasn't gotten more attention. So when she was at Oral Roberts University, which is, you know, kind of a charismatic Pentecostal school in Oklahoma, she was a research assistant to a guy named John Eidsmoe, who she still cites as a major influence on her. Now, John Eidsmoe is, often people in the Christian right are kind of called theocratic. But he is unquestionably a theocrat. He wrote a book that she worked on called Christianity and the Constitution, which argued that the United States was founded to be a Christian theocracy and that it should become one again. John Eidsmoe is an interesting figure. He's someone who has been asked not to speak at Tea Party, has had invitations to speak at Tea Party rallies rescinded because of his ties to white supremacist groups and history of advocating for Southern secession.
Her family doesn't all agree with her.
Right. Yeah, she was born in a family of working-class Democrats and became born again in high school, you know, and kind of went on that path on her own. She has a stepsister who's a lesbian who they were close when they were growing up, and her stepsister has really shied away from the public eye, in part because her father is still married to Michele Bachmann's mother. But the stepsister, Helen Lefebvre, you know, there are a couple of other siblings on that side of the family who have been really appalled to see, not just to see Michele Bachmann take the lead on on opposing gay marriage, especially given the fact that Helen and her partner have been together for over 20 years, but also the way that she has kind of distorted family's history, that she claimed at one point to have polled the 9 siblings. It's a blended family with 5 kids on one side and 4 on the other. She had claimed to poll them about gay marriage and said that the majority agreed with them, which
with her,
right, which shocked her stepbrother enough to go public, because he just said, not only is it not true, but, you know, what a shocking accusation to think about brothers and sisters kind of taking a vote about one of their members.
And what about her family, her kids, her husband?
Well, her kids, you know, her kids have not been that public. I think her older son is she sometimes talks about as being one of her closest advisors. She has another son who joined AmeriCorps, which, as you remember, she at one point talked about as being, you know, part of a kind of sinister campaign to indoctrinate children into one world government. And so we can assume that maybe he doesn't entirely share her fear. But her husband is an interesting figure because he's she often talks about how they run a business. Their business is his Christian counseling service. It's hard to overestimate what a big role not just anti-gay marriage, but kind of anti-gay politics, period, played in her early political career. And her husband's really a part of that. He's often talked about the need, he's called in some interviews, he's called homosexuals barbarians who need to be educated. He says, just because you have certain impulses doesn't mean you need to act on them. He's been associated with, reparative therapy, which can be obviously incredibly damaging to people who undergo it and kind of try to change their immutable sexual orientation.
Do they raise foster children?
I think raise is the tricky word. She often says, as recently as this week, she said that her family has raised 23 foster children. Sometimes she talks about it as if they're all in the house. She'll say, I know the cost of food because I have, 28 children and I go shopping and I have these huge bills. I think there's no doubt that she's had foster children and that's commendable. But when you say raise, you probably, I think, assume that you're talking about a long period of time. And she had a foster care license for 7.5 years. It allowed her to have 3 children at a time. Everyone I've talked to, including, senior social workers in Stillwater, said that some of these kids some of them she might have had for more than a year, some of them she had for a couple of days, or a couple of weeks. I don't know if you could say that somebody who stayed in your house for a couple of weeks, you certainly deserve a lot of credit for giving them shelter. I don't know that you could say that you raised them.